way of introduction, I'm just going to introduce our moderator, and our moderator will go ahead and introduce the rest of the panel. Clement, if you want to go ahead and you're more than welcome to turn your video on and mute yourself as well. So Dr. Vitt is a proud member of the Paraka and Alangaitao tribes of Chuk in the Federated States of Micronesia, and is an international educator who has served in higher education in the US for more than 20 years. He is currently the coordinator of study abroad and exchange programs, focusing on Asia and Oceania at the College of Professional and Global Education at San Jose University. Previously, he was director of the Pacific Islander Student Center at UH Hilo, and associate director of the Center for Multicultural Learning at Santa Clara University. He is the founder of the Pacific Leadership Assistance Network, known as PLAN, aimed at linking Micronesian scholars, researchers, community organizers, trainers with organizations and agencies that serve the Micronesians at home and abroad. His research interest focuses on strength-based approaches to supporting Micronesian college students in the United States. Without further ado, I'll pass it along to our moderator and panel. Test.
Fellow Chukis, proud to say that. Hiro Lam, Hiro Matau, Hiro Fanim, Hiro Wami Meyon. I want to join the fellow children of Chuk as a fellow Chukis and to say that I am very proud of the work that you children are doing. Work that you've done this morning to break open this space, this meeting, this meet, was and is very important to us because you remind us of why we're doing what we're doing in schools. You remind us of why Auntie Ino does what she does for you and with you at KKV and in the community. So, Isotawur Van Bremi. I also want to take this moment as a moderator to just pay respect to the indigenous people of these lands that we occupy. Let it be known that we Micronesians who are on your lands respect you and respect your history and respect the fact that you yourself seek to be honored and respected for these lands that have been taken from you. As an indigenous Chukis, I say that with great respect. That said, I'm going to step off the political thing just to make sure that the law school doesn't get into trouble, US government. I will now take the, I'm honored to introduce our panelists today. We have two panelists and one that's joining us via virtually, and another panelist that is not here today due to personal reasons, but I have her prepared talk and her paper, which I will read when we get to that point. It is my honor to introduce the first panelists, and I will introduce all of them first, and then we'll hand it over to them before we moderate the questions. Professor Kenneth Goffigan Cooper is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Micronesian Studies at my alma mater, University of Guam, where he focuses on geopolitics, decolonialization, and militarization. He is also the director of the Pacific Center for Island Security. My friend Joe Enlet is fellow Chukis, a PhD student at the University of Rhode Island. Formerly, he served as Consul General of the Federated States of Micronesia to the Western United States. His research focuses on international fisheries policy and geopolitics in the Pacific. Mr. Clement Yo Molalap, a Xavier grad along with Joe, is a legal advisor to the permanent mission of the Federated States of Micronesia, FSM, to the United Nations, as well as generally to the national government of the FSM on projects involving international law. And our fourth panelist is Professor Patricia O'Brien, who is a Pacific historian and analyst at Georgetown University's Center for Strategic and International Studies, and at ANU. Her work covers an array of global contemporary topics, concentrating on Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands, as well as the United States as biographies. I will now turn the mic over to Professor Cooper to open up with some opening remarks.
All right, so Howdy, everyone.
There
we go. So Masi Kioni and all the other organizers for inviting me today to speak. I look forward to the rest of today and from learning from everyone here. I want to begin by acknowledging my positionality. I'm a Tomoru, son of the Marianas, born and raised in Guam, and I'm not a citizen of any of the freely associated states. Thus, I share my perspectives here, more specifically focused on the geopolitical machinations at work with the compacts from the vantage point of Guam and Micronesia. So with this being said, there are guiding questions for this panel, and I want to use my 15 minutes to go through these. Please let me know when it's like, shut up, bro. Let me know when that moment comes. It might, okay? So, the first question posed to this panel is, what role has the relationship between the US and the freely associated states played in US and Micronesian strategic thinking? The simple answer for US strategic thinking is quite a lot. Okay? After World War II, particularly with the attack on Pearl Harbor, many in the United States believed that American security demanded American control over Micronesia at least. The Joint Strategic Survey Committee, which was a subcommittee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued that if Micronesia was under US control, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would not have been successful. Of course, scholars debate the feasibility of this, but it's just that was some rhetoric of that time. Nonetheless, this led the United States to take action to make this a reality. Historian Hal Friedman writes that the Pacific represents the only region of the world where the United States deviated from its wartime political pledge not to obtain direct physical control over foreign territory. We can see this with the push for Micronesia under the auspices of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands to be a strategic trust, okay, under the administration of the Security Council of the United Nations. Now, this designation was primarily the result of the War and Naval Departments of the United States, who protested and believed that having the trust status of Micronesia fall under the Trusteeship Council and thus falling under the General Assembly for dissolution would jeopardize American security interests. This eventually seeped into the wording of the Trusteeship Agreement of Micronesia. For example, listen to this phrase. The administering authority shall promote the development of the inhabitants of the trust territory towards self-government or independence as may be appropriate to the particular circumstances of the trust territory and its people and the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned. That phrase took a long time to create, okay? It was the result of a back and forth exchange between the United States and the USSR. Originally, the United States did not want to include the word independence, but the USSR insisted. The US, after including independence, then responded by adding the words as may be appropriate. So as Masahiro Igarashi notes, this is very interesting because it expresses the US government's reluctance to grant Micronesia an independent status from the beginning. Let's trace this a bit more. After World War II, American military strategists became even more convinced that a key component to American security in East Asia was turning the Pacific Basin into a quote-unquote American lake, which inevitably meant American control of strategically located Micronesia. As the Joint Chiefs of Staff said at the time, the Pacific and East Asia were now inseparable for planning purposes. Control of Micronesia was to play its role in the military's move to have mobile forces and island bases in the region, and was to even play a role as a contingency plan against aggression from the USSR, as our keynote speaker addressed earlier. The islands would help constitute a base network from which offensives could be launched from. In addition, military planners argued that bases for mobile forces was not the only reason to control island chains. Rather, these chains of islands were to be controlled even if they were not to be developed into bases, so that they can be denied to others. This would balance military security needs with potential domestic concerns on overspending on the development of these islands into bases. Thus, a core component of the compacts at the time that were negotiated was strategic denial. All three assigned the United States responsibility for the security and defense of the FAS, which includes strategic denial over land, airspace, territorial seas, the right to deny third country access to or use of the FAS territories for military purposes, as well as the right to establish US bases and defense facilities in the FAS. For the United States, this is the heart of the Compacts of Free Association. However, it is not the Compacts of Free Association alone that enshrine this aspect of strategic denial. In order to fully understand the relationship between the freely associated states and the US, one cannot ignore the role of subsidiary agreements, as the text of those agreements help us gain a clearer picture of US-FAS relations. It is important to look at agreements such as the Mutual Security Agreements, the Military Use and Operating Rights Agreement, where the security relationship between the FAS and the US have more permanence than do economic assistance packages. So this leads to the second question. What is the contemporary role of the Compacts of Free Association in US and Micronesian strategy? First and foremost, strategic denial is still an important benefit the US gains from the compacts, and which is particularly important amongst great power tensions with China. Strategic denial allows the freely associated states to act as important buffers between military bases in my home island of Guam and East Asia. As cited in a recent study, the US right of strategic denial in the FAS territorial seas knit together US forward presence in the region and function as a beachhead for US engagement with other Pacific nations. Beyond strategic denial, we can also see where the freely associated states fit in the US military's shifting perspectives on force posture in the region. Nowadays, it might also be more appropriate to think of strategic denial as strategic affirmation or strategic lifeline. The quote-unquote American lake is continuously used for training exercises to demonstrate power, emerging alliances, as well as study venues for potential conflict. Just keeping the water out of the hands of potential adversaries seems no longer enough for the United States. More and more, the military is shifting to what we call a distributed and dispersed operating concept. This refers to spreading service members and military assets across a larger swath of locations and operating environments, so they are not concentrated in one central location. China now has the ability to strike US bases throughout the Indo-Pacific region. Once, US posture has been seen as a deterrent to adversaries. Today, US bases and posture in the region are associated with targeting risk. Essentially, dispersal is about being less predictable to your adversary and complicating their calculations and targeting. As a Hudson Institute report reads, Indo-Pacific posture enhancement should aim to shift the US military's brittle posture to a more distributed one that leverages clusters of mutually supported locations in US, allied, and partner territory. This is reflected in the Air Force's shift to agile combat employment, where aircraft and equipment are dispersed between major hubs and smaller airfields at remote locations, or the Marine Corps' Force Design 2030 emphasis on distributed operations. However, as my colleague in the Pacific Center for Island Security, Leland Bettis, writes, to distribute and disperse forces, you must have a lot of places they can be distributed. This is where one can see another important aspect of the freely associated states in Micronesia, to act as more places to operate from and utilize the relevant provision of the respective compacts. As some argue, dispersing assets across COFA states bolsters one's resilience and deterrence value, i.e. they are available in the event that access to Andersen Air Force Base or other Western Pacific locations is limited or denied. However, it is not only assets that are being distributed, but also risk. So this should be considered as we track the new planned military installations in the Federated States of Micronesia and Palau. So this contemporary importance helps to explain why US analysts have talked about the importance of ensuring that the economic provisions of the compacts are renegotiated correctly. The economic provisions serve as a core of the overall COFA, particularly from the Micronesian perspective. Thus, some analysts worry that a failure to negotiate these correctly will lead to the FAS being quote unquote more vulnerable to predatory and coercive behavior from the PRC, whatever you want to take from that, okay? So in the US view, the renewed economic provisions will help keep FAS country governments quote unquote stable. So the final question I will address is, what are the key global challenges ahead as seen from Washington and other FAS capitals? I argue that the islands of Micronesia lie in the turbulent waters of a violent geography. Like a volcano, it does not continuously erupt, but the potential for destruction is ever present. Propelling the dangerous current of these waters is the intersection of traditional geopolitical security concerns and other existential security issues, such as climate change and food security. So properly addressing and strategically prioritizing these potentially competing concerns, thank you, that actually helps a lot, Micronesian security landscape. Closer attentions must be paid to how shifting geopolitical tectonic plates in the region will affect core island security concerns. Micronesia is already feeling the effects of climate change, and anxiety is growing over the threat posed to the region. It is not an exaggeration to say that climate change remains a primary security threat and existential threat to the region. But despite shared values and strong partnerships, it is erroneous to say that the United States and the freely associated states are in the same boat and face the same threats. The projected future of the United States has already arrived in Micronesia, as the two sides are working on two different timelines of direct impact. Many in the United States acknowledge the harsh realities of climate change. However, unless these realities are directly experienced, they can still feel like a dystopian future rather than a present threat. For Micronesia, however, this dystopia has in many ways already arrived. Leaders in the FAS are already creating adaptations plans for sea level rise, and not a hypothetical backup plan, but as something to be implemented. Thus, the United States and Micronesia do not seem to share the same sense of urgency in reversing climate change. And this incongruity needs to be considered from the US engagement side. So as Micronesia faces these non-traditional existential threats, leaders of the regions must also pay closer attention to traditional geopolitical security. Micronesia may one day be the grass on which the proverbial elephants fight. Furthermore, even if the elephants do not fight on Micronesian grass, the field will be forever changed in preparation for the fight. That which happens to prepare for conflict can, like conflict itself, be also destructive. Thus, a primary security concern for Micronesia needs to be maintaining actual peace in the region. This provides both a challenge and an opportunity. Micronesian leaders can use their diplomatic prowess to secure climate justice. When push comes to shove during a conflict with China or another aggressor, the United States will fall back on Micronesia. One only needs to look at those provisions of the respective agreements or the separate military use and operating rights agreement. So to summarize, the stakes are not the same for the United States on China, and China on one hand, and the Micronesian islands on the other. The people of Micronesia can engage with states, organizations, and other actors, as they are already doing so, and can help reduce miscalculations of geopolitical tensions. The islands lie at the intersection of climate change and this intensifying geopolitical heat, but there is no law that the islands must forever float at this intersection. Micronesians did not put themselves in these positions. The leaders and people of Micronesia can come together to best figure out how to steer their collective future in such a violent geography. The only thing certain is that the future of Micronesia is brightest when those who create the maps are those who call the region home. Micronesians themselves should craft what a truly free and open Micronesia will look like. A Micronesian cartography can birth a more peaceful geography. Situs Ponce.
Thank you very much, Professor Rupert. Joan?
So we've been, I Raranim, Gevi Sin, and Biro, Fail Gevi, it's on our gay one, it's on our social media. My deep respects to all of you. I cannot say everybody that I want to thank, so I'll just say thank you to Keone and your team of supporters and everybody who has really supported this symposium and the creation of this theme of unpacking the compacts of free associations. Thank you. I'm glad that they chose a guy named Joe to sit next in between a lawyer and a professor. I was a diplomat, so I guess I'm gonna have to make peace between these two. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a professor. I am a storyteller, and so please forgive me, I will tell stories right now. I broke down my talk into just three snippets of this story. I cannot help but begin my talk with a phrase that our late brother Joachim Peter, or Jojo as he's affectionately known, that he coined. He said, "We are all COFA citizens." For Jojo, and I believe many of us who have grown up in the era of the Compact of Free Association, COFA is a relationship that whether we like it or not, we are a part of, US citizens and FAS citizens alike, because it originates in story. This story of relationship, now enshrined in COFA, did not begin with Compact 1 in the 1980s. It began generations before that. It began when islanders in the North Pacific were caught up in a world struggle that was not their own, causing them to be first-hand witnesses to the terror of war. It is marked in our land, sea, and airspace, when some of World War II's fiercest and bloodiest battles stained the soil of indigenous lands and washed into the pristine seas and filled the air with suffocating smoke. I do not say these things to be dramatic and profound, although I think they're kind of dramatic and profound. I say it because it is the literal history of when the US and Micronesia crossed paths in history in an era that has been a theater of conflict, of nuclear devastation, and natural resource exploitation. But I also say it because despite of and within that theater of competing world and geopolitical interests, proud Micronesians, navigators, who navigated the vast open seas for millennia, exercised their right to self-determination and declared to the world a reality they've always known to be true, that they are inherently sovereign and independent peoples. That, ladies and gentlemen, is an important plot within the story of our COFA relationship. And any rendering of COFA must always reckon with that truth. Because in a healthy relationship, we must first and foremost begin by respecting the sacredness of each other's independence before we can forge a mutually respectful interdependence. This story is critical to ensuring that our mutual and interdependent relationship under the COFA is built on the very basic human trait, trust. It is akin to what navigators call the mwil, marker of where we come from, and our mwem, a marker of where we are going, so that we may know where we are in time. Unpacking COFA then, I believe, for both US citizens and FAS citizens, from that relational and historic framework, is a deliberate act of self-understanding. What does the COFA say about who we are as a people in relationship? This relationship is also principled. I'm sure that Many of you international relations scholars and our good old realists are probably scoffing at my untrained political speak and how I'm framing COFA. I'm just an island boy after all. But taking a step back, however, I do want to iterate the fact that from the perspective of indigenous COFA islanders, there is no naive denial of the real security threats that do exist in the region, as we've witnessed in recent times. Our own COFA island leaders have spoken out clearly on numerous occasions against geopolitical activities that were perceived to create instability in the region, undermined state sovereignty, or violated the tenets of human rights. I submit to you today that these acts of speaking out, even if we don't have our own militaries, are the material expression of our island sophistication in reading and judging for ourselves what are those threats to our islands and our livelihoods. These judgments have been made on principle and values, and not merely on politics and affiliations. Our shared principles and values are of regional peace, democracy, respect of sovereignty, human rights, justice, and the rule of law. An important perspective from the COFA Islands is that our dealings must be principled so that we don't render the FAS as mere pawns in the grand scheme of international order. For COFA, this means that our relationships are not just a club of affiliation and blind loyalty, but one built on values and principles. When our friends, whatever nation they come from, and allies, when they abandon these deep-seated values, COFA nations have the moral obligation to speak out. That is the bedrock of our diplomacy. A vivid display of this is shown when on January 7th, 2021, in the wake of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, FSM President David W. Panuelo said in a public statement that the FSM is typically among the most ardent supporters of America, and that America is our friend. But, and I quote, "Friends have an obligation to look their friends in the eye and tell them when something is wrong and when their behavior is unacceptable." So as friends, we must be willing to ask the tough questions. Is the status quo acceptable? Is there equity in the compacts? Are reparations for nuclear impacts sufficient? Do the economic provisions truly address the needs of the people of the FAS? From the region's perspective, we've given everything we've got: land, sea, and airspace, and it keeps on giving. And even our sons and daughters proudly put their lives on the line in military uniform for the idea of a free world. Do the current provisions of economic assistance and free immigration reflect a respectful and mutually interdependent relationship? To me, it would be a betrayal of our relationship and our mutual values of democracy and freedom if the COFA agreements were framed and treated as purely matters of strategic and economic interests, and thus valued strictly by its utilitarian significance, and not its relationship significance. And let me state frankly, the impetus of the compact relations should not be the US versus China narrative. Instead, the bedrock of our compacts ought to be our mutually shared relationships, values. Third part of my talk, a courageous relationship. So as we set sail once again on this voyage to renegotiate this new chapter in COFA relationships, in this time when there is increasing geopolitical, conflict in the region, as so well articulated by my panelists here. In this time of climate change destruction on our lands, islands, due to human-caused actions, and increasing appetites for exploiting of our natural resources like our fish, and now even the increasing threat of things like deep seabed mining. How strongly can we trust that we will act in the interest of our people, the COFA citizens? COFA citizens, I'm talking about Palauan citizens, FSM citizens, RMI citizens, and yes, US citizens. Because if the US is truly our first and foremost ally, deeply bound to us through this historic COFA relationship, then it will partner with us in our efforts against what we as Micronesians believe to be the security threats to our livelihoods, like climate change, biodiversity destruction, and the overexploitation of our oceans. We ought not to privilege one side's view of security, because security for a fisherman in the village of Arotia Sopu on Wera, Chuk State will be very different from security from the perspective of a person in Rhode Island. I have no idea why I picked Rhode Island. It just sounded nice. If we are truly to hold each other accountable as friends, then the US should commit to not increasing the burning of fossil fuels, not restricting access to the benefits of its bounty for our COFA migrants, not to treat us as pawns in this struggle for geopolitical dominance, but instead be responsible and careful COFA citizens. We, COFA Island nations, should promote not only a free and open Indo-Pacific, but a fair, a just, a sustainable, a healthy, and a prosperous Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
I also want to add that my sense of gratitude to Brother Joe for saying yes to VP Peone for the last minute addition to. He is actually on the next panel as well, but he did say yes to be on this panel. Rhode Island, that's where he's doing his PhD, right? That's a context. He is the first islander of Rhode Island. And I want also to honor the deepest gratitude to Clement for piping in all the way from Jamaica, where he is, I believe, attending the Seabed Authority, and he can demonstrate that. So that's where he's coming from. So without further ado, Clement, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Vid. Can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me loud and clear? All right. Yeah, so
Yes.
if I cut in and out, just please wave your hand or tell me to stop or something like that. Just to maybe a few prefatory remarks. First of all, I very much extend my gratitude to the journal as well as to the law school for organizing this symposium and inviting me to join. I also apologize for not joining you in person. Like Dr. Vid said, I am in Jamaica for work, not for fun, for work. But I very much wish I could be there in person, not least because I haven't been back to Hawaii in over 3 years at this point because of the pandemic. I think it's not an exaggeration for me to say that I would not be where I am in my professional career, including here in Jamaica, if not for the education that I received at the William S. Richardson School of Law, including from the late and great Professor John Van Dyke, an important international law scholar, as well as a true friend to the Pacific. So thank you all very much, and my respectful greetings to all of you. Second thing is that I'm here in my personal capacity rather than representing the government of the FSM or any governmental entity. And the views that I'll express here are not necessarily the views of the FSM national government, although I'll try not to go too crazy and spout whatever I want to spout. And lastly, to Joe, I think technically I'm over your shoulder, Joe, rather than on your side. So does that mean I'm a devil or the angel for you? We can discuss that at some other time. But I'm very, very happy to go after Professor Cooper as well as Joe. The remarks that they delivered, a lot of which overlap with what I'm about to say, especially the conclusion of Joe's remarks, which have a lot of resonance for what I would like to say. Like Professor Cooper indicated, there were a number of guiding questions that were shared with the panelists in advance of today's symposium to try to guide our thinking and our presentations. And I would like to focus on a couple of them for my remarks, specifically the question on the contemporary role of the compacts of free association, as well as their relationship to the key global challenges facing the COFA states. And like Joe said, the COFA states are not just the FSM, Palau, and the Marshall Islands, but also the United States. And I want to speak about this in the context of the work that I'm doing for the FSM at the United Nations and in other multilateral fora, and trying to think about the question of a changing global order, which is the theme for this symposium. And in my view, there are different ways that we can define what it means to have a changing global order. But one sort of example of a changing global order is a surge in global interest in recent years, especially in the last 7 to 10 years, in targeted treaty making, multilateral treaty making, particularly with respect to what are called the triple planetary crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and plastic pollution. And there's been a lot of interest to try to agree at the multilateral level to legally binding instruments, treaties essentially, to tackle these crises that has been absent. That sort of interest in treaty making has been largely absent in other aspects of international law and relations. And I think this is important in part because the Compact of Free Association between the FSM and the US, there is a section 161 of the Compact, which obligates the US and the FSM to promote efforts to prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere of the FSM. Section 161 lists a number of ways that the FSM and the US can work towards these efforts. But in my view, those examples are not necessarily exhaustive. And in any case, that language in 161 is a strong statement of at least policy interest of the US and the FSM in protecting the environment of the FSM from harm. And that's kind of how I would like to structure my remarks, to talk about how the US and the FSM and other two freely associated states have engaged with each other in these multilateral settings in negotiating and implementing treaties pertaining to environmental matters, to those triple planetary crises that I talked about: climate change, biodiversity loss, and plastic pollution. And Joe touched on them, and Professor Cooper touched on them as well in his talk. So that's basically what I'm going to do for the rest of my remarks, just have a bit of a survey of those processes, give a little bit of insight into the dynamics between the freely associated states and the US, as well as other players, including China, in those settings. So maybe just starting with climate change, the Pacific Islands Forum as a whole, so the Pacific Islands as well as Australia and New Zealand, we've identified climate change as the greatest existential threat to the Pacific Islands. And the FSM national government, particularly under the current Panuelo administration, has prioritized tackling the climate crisis as a primary objective of our foreign affairs engagements, including in our direct engagements with the United States as well as China. In the negotiations for the Paris Agreement, the US and the freely associated states, and special shout out to the Republic of the Marshall Islands, played a key role in putting together what was called the High Ambition Coalition to secure key elements in the Paris Agreement, including a 1.5 degree temperature target, strong language on what's called transparency, as well as a sort of net zero target around the middle of this century. In those negotiations, China was a particular challenge, in part because China did not want to assume the same sort of obligations as, for example, the United States wanted to assume. But the freely associated states made a strategic decision to ally with the US and other developed countries to push for a more level playing field in tackling climate change, while allowing for some particular allowances for individual countries. That was a high water mark in a lot of ways in US and FAS relations in climate change negotiations. Since the Paris Agreement was adopted and entered into force, there have been challenges in the implementation of it, including in the relationship between the US and, for example, the freely associated states. One recent example of that has to do with loss and damage. The establishment of a fund, of a finance facility or a fund to address what's called loss and damage under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And loss and damage is basically irreversible harm as a result of climate change that you cannot mitigate or that you cannot adapt to. And small island developing states like the FSM, the Marshall Islands, and Palau have long advocated for a fund to address loss and damage effects in particularly vulnerable countries. The US has been long resistant to this, in part because it did not want to be tagged with liability or compensation angles in the fund. And the US was one of the very last holdouts in the recent climate change conference in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt against this fund. The US finally relented, but it needed certain concessions from the FSM and other small island developing states that was very difficult for us to concede. And an interesting dynamic there was China being a strong supporter of the fund and being very allied with the FSM and other small island developing states in pushing for the establishment of the fund, with the US on the opposite side. So that was an interesting dynamic there. Another interesting dynamic is what's playing out right now in the United Nations, the General Assembly. There is a request for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on obligations to address climate change. This has been led very strongly by Pacific Island countries, starting at the grassroots youth level, and has now secured the support of over 100 countries, over 100 members of the United Nations General Assembly. And adoption of this resolution is slated for next week. The US has been resistant in this process. There is a number of legal, but also policy and financial concerns about this. But the FSM and other freely associated states have been working very closely bilaterally with the US to try to get the US to, at the very least, not call for a vote in the General Assembly against this resolution and to just let the process play out. And we're hoping that'll be the case. The other example, major example of climate change action has to do with what's called the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. This is a pretty technical treaty, multilateral agreement, that addresses what are called HFCs or hydrofluorocarbons, basically substances that are used in air conditioners, among other things, that have been discovered to play a very strong role in driving global warming, driving climate change. They're short-lived climate pollutants that are very, very impactful. The FSM and the US were able to work together with a coalition of a number of other countries in recent years to secure the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol that calls for the phase down of the production and consumption of these HFCs. And actually, the US Senate, I think last year, maybe a couple of years ago, ratified the Kigali Amendment, which I think might be one of, if not the only recent examples of the US Senate ratifying any environmental treaty in recent years. The implementation of the Kigali Amendment will, among other things, contribute to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. So this has been a good example of US and Chinese sort of cooperation, US and FAS cooperation in climate change. And interestingly enough, China was very difficult to deal with in these negotiations for valid domestic sort of business and other reasons, but they eventually came on board. So that's in the climate change space. And like Joe said, the FSM has been very direct with the US and with China about the need to have strong domestic as well as international action to address climate change. And indeed, in the hopefully the extension of the economic provisions of the compact between the FSM and the US, there will be language in there that will direct funding for climate change and related activities. The other two areas have to do with biodiversity loss and plastic pollution. And a lot of the work that I've been doing in recent years here at the UN has to do with negotiating a couple of treaties and related instruments under the law of the sea. One of them is called the BBNJ agreement. Others have called it the High Seas Treaty, and basically having to do with the conservation and sustainable use of marine life of areas beyond national jurisdictions, such as the high seas and the international seabed area. The US and the FSM have been closely allied in a lot of the sort of major conservation elements of that treaty negotiation. Whereas countries like China have been resistant to some of those conservation elements in particular because of their ongoing fisheries and related interests in this space. And the other element in the law of the sea has to do with the mining code of the International Seabed Authority, which is where I am now, where we are currently negotiating possible exploitation regulations for deep seabed mining in the international seabed area. And you see some of the same dynamics playing out with the United States and the FSM collaborating on quite a few key issues and positions that aim to protect our interests in the Pacific Ocean, including the environment, whereas countries like China have been pushing more of an exploitation angle in this process. And the other example that I mentioned has to do with plastic pollution. As folks might be aware, there are ongoing negotiations right now for a new international legally binding instrument, essentially a treaty to end plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. And this kind of comes a little bit full circle, but in a bit of a twist. The United States, in the negotiations for the plastic pollution treaty, want to take a sort of Paris Agreement approach. And the Paris Agreement approach is basically a bottom-up approach where individual countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement take domestic actions that they then announce to the world, basically, and they're transparent about, but they don't have any sort of top-down obligations to do certain climate actions. Whether that'll prove effective for the Paris Agreement in the long run remains to be seen. By contrast, that is the same sort of approach that the US wants to take with plastic pollution. By contrast, the FSM and other freely associated states, we would like to take more of a top-down approach where you have a treaty that establishes certain binding targets addressing the design, production, use, management, and elimination of plastic pollution, including from the marine environment. And then parties at the domestic level will have to implement those obligations. And so it'll be interesting to see how the US will engage with the FSM and other freely associated states in coming to a landing zone here. And as we're engaging in all of these processes, I'm constantly keeping in my mind that provision of the compact that I cited before, obligating the FSM and the US to pursue efforts to prevent or eliminate harm to the environment and the biosphere of the FSM. And there are multiple ways that this can be done. And in my view, the US has done a decent job in pursuing some of these efforts, but it can do a lot better. And I will echo what Joe said about how insistent at least the freely associated states need to be in our engagements with the US to keep on pushing the US through the context of our compact relationship and broader international relations to achieve those goals. I think I might have 30 seconds left in my talk, and I will not make a joke because I think I already made a joke at the beginning with Joe. So I will end here. Thank you.
Thanks, Clement. I will take this time to read a very short paper statement from Professor O'Brien, if that's okay. In the meantime, I want to remind all of you who are present here that if you do have any questions for the panelists, I believe there are papers that are being passed around for you to.
You can collect any of the note cards from earlier if you guys have any questions.
There you go. Okay.
Send it to the aisle.
There you go. Thank you very much. So this is from Professor Patricia O'Brien from Georgetown University and Australian National University. Title, Outcompeting China, a View of the COFAs from Washington. The considerable efforts to invigorate and reshape the US's approach to the Pacific Islands since March 2022 have not dislodged the compacts of free association agreements between the US and the Republic of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. The COFAs remain the linchpin of the US's Pacific engagement. The Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy of February 2022 has now had its first birthday, and China continues to loom over the US's multiple efforts in the Pacific, not least the renegotiation of the compacts. In the initial framing document of the Indo-Pacific strategy, China was barely mentioned by name, though officials made no secret that the strategy of all about combating China, as well as other motivations stemming from region, need, and priorities. 1 year into the Indo-Pacific strategy, there has been a marked change in the way the role of China is being framed. It is blatantly stated in the State Department budget justification released on March 9, 2023, that the administration's ambitious international efforts are a mission to, quote, outcompete China, end quote. It is in this context that the COFAs are being renegotiated. This language is about sending a message to China, but it is also speaking to the decision makers in America's deeply fractured political landscape. This language is intended to unify Congress behind the Biden administration's plans that will be critical to the passage of the COFAs. Over the past year, the US government has been building out and on the COFA agreements that have commanded the lion's share of resources in US Pacific engagement for over 4 decades, and the COFA agreements will continue to occupy this preeminent place. The State Department's budget, US's final financial commitment, let me reread that. The State Department's budget justification, which is where all of these efforts will be concentrated as opposed to being dispersed across multiple agencies, puts the COFAs in context with its overall strategy. It's stated that, quote, we are significantly expanding the US presence and programs in the Pacific Islands, including the renewal of our compacts of free association and a generational commitment to provide economic assistance and federal programs and services to the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. It's on page 178. End quote. The budget numbers, these introductory words preface, attest to this change. The document outlines, quote, discretionary and mandatory resources, end quote, for an array of programs across the region with the, quote, extension and amendment of the 3 compacts at the center of all these efforts. As of writing, the 3rd iterations of the compact agreements are entering the final stages of their labyrinthine negotiations that recommended in March 2022. They were kickstarted by the appointment of presidential envoy, Ambassador Joseph Yun, to lead these complex efforts. 1 year on, memorandums of understandings have been signed between the US and the 3 COFA nations. These MOUs, according to Ambassador Yun, who spoke to me recently about the status of negotiations, are agreements on the, quote, top line numbers. And this is an interview with Ambassador Yun, March 10, 2023. The top line numbers amounts to, quote, $6.5 billion in economic assistance and $634 million for continued U.S. Postal Services to the FAS for a total of over $7.1 billion over the next 20-year period. End quote. Put simply, though there is little that is simple about the COFAS, once you dig into the details, this figure means at least an additional $125 million per year. However, Washington-based experts like Yun caution that it is very, quote, hard to compare, end quote, the previous COFAS with what is being proposed now because of where the money goes, either in grant assistance or trust funds. That said, Yun noted that it was a significant, quote, significant increase, end quote. The significant increase came after the Freely Associated States united in September 2022, ahead of the US Pacific Island Summit, to push US's financial commitments higher, capitalizing on China's looming presence to their advantage in this instance. Now that the MOUs have been signed, over the next 6 months, Yun is anticipating the next phase of negotiations will be successfully completed. The next phase entails hammering out details and fiscal procedures agreement and how the trust fund agreements will manage. Also, each of these three freely associated states will need to sign 9 separate agreements with the agencies and departments party to the COFAS. In total, 27 agreements still need to be settled on and signed. Yun is anticipating that this phase will be completed by the end of the fiscal year. He's not expecting this phase of the negotiations to produce any surprises. It is the final quarter of 2023 that things might get interesting. This is when the COFAS will head to Congress, where they need to be passed quickly before the current agreements for the RMI and the FSM expire in 2024. Let me just put aside this this is not Professor O'Brien's. I just want to remind the estimated 94,000 COFA citizens in the United States that the Compact of Free Association are not expiring. We are talking about the economic provisions. I know that people are nervous about that idea that the compacts are expiring in total. They are not. Let me continue. Given the composition and culture of the 118th Congress, there is trepidation about how the COFAS will fare. There is the acrimonious issue of the debt ceiling. Now bank failures create an even more tenuous fiscal setting. There are also concerns that language about climate action will meet resistance, and for this reason, it is reasonable to expect that the COFAS will be worded in ways to not unsettle Republicans. There will also be concerns about the oversight provisions. COFAS have repeatedly cited the onerous burdens of meeting these requirements. So it will be interesting to see how the competing concerns will be balanced in the final documents. When asked about potential challenges, Ambassador Yun noted that the budget request for the COFAS is small in relation to the 6.9 trillion budget. He also noted the COFAS encompass many bipartisan issues, from defense to constituent support, that will override the divisions or concerns about funding levels or any adjustments to oversight. I spoke to Ambassador Yun just after the release of FSM President David Panuelo's explosive letter of March 7, 2023, detailing China's domestic interference and his intention to explore establishing diplomatic relations with Taiwan. All that President Panuelo outlined about China's attempt to erode FSM's ties to the US, and most alarmingly, the specter of conflict, will underscore the importance to Congress of dealing quickly with COFA legislation. It goes without saying that Washington would welcome the FSM switching its alliance to Taiwan. The question remains about whether President Panuelo, will be able to effect this change in the time he has left in his term, which expires soon. It also goes without saying that Washington will be closely watching Micronesia's political machinations about Panuelo's defeat in the March 7th elections. It is interesting to note that negotiating an upscale COFA deal did not provide President Panuelo with the political capital he needed to retain office. So it remains to be seen whether China will be a wedge in this COFA relationship between the FSM and the US, or the means to bring the nations closer together. One way Washington will tip scale in this favor would be for President Biden to accept the invitation extended by Micronesia's President's Summit in February 2023 to visit. So, what are the global challenges ahead as seen from Washington that intersect with the COFAs? The answer depends on political affiliations. For Democrats, climate and sea level rises are the leading concerns, as it is the case for all Pacific nations, especially the FAS. For the Republicans, GOP is China, a concern that also preoccupies Democrats, as noted. But within the bipartisan concern about China, the GOP sees this issue predominantly through military and defense lens. The GOP first sees island chains and strategic considerations, and the COFAs factor heavily into this worldview as agreements, as the agreements are the bulwark against the creation of constellation of Chinese air bases and ports throughout the region, as happened during World War II. Democrats are also acutely attuned to these concerns, but also emphasize the health and human development and climate security aspects of the deals. There is usual financial commitments. There is usual genuine contrition and remorse from many in Washington about the US nuclear legacy of the RMI. And Ambassador Yun said that the COFA with RMI will address this in ways, and quote, consistent, end quote, with Section 177 of the first COFA agreement. Democrats also articulate the US struggle against China, as well as Russia, as one against democracy and authoritarian regimes, and the COFAs are a means to maintain a liberal, rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. The fate of Ukraine and Taiwan are critical to all of these layered and intersecting concerns. And President Xi's late March 2023 visit to Moscow bring these two fronts together. Russian activity in the Pacific Ocean was a catalyst for the advent of the COFAs in the mid-1980s. Now, 40 years later, Russia, in apparent cooperation with China, casts also a looming shadow over the current COFA negotiations, as it does for virtually every other component of the global security landscape. And that's the end of Professor O'Brien's paper.
Thank you. We only have, I know we're over time, we're just going to take a 5-minute break before the next session, unfortunately. But there is one question that we received in just a couple sentences, if possible. And then we'll go straight to our break after. Thank you.
There is one question, potentially a second now, but this is the question. Under the compact, What role should the US play, or what type of compensation should be?
Sorry, the one that says this one.
Strike that. This one we read. What would be the impact of the FAS countries refusing to sign the next compact if the US excludes climate action? Is that clear?
We can ask them in conjunction.
Anyone want to take that? Clement. Since you're the devil over, the question again is.
I heard the question.
Did you hear that?
I heard the question. Yes, that's a bit of a difficult question to ask. When you say sign the compact, the compact or the compacts, at least between the US and the FSM and the Marshall Islands, they will continue even if the economic provisions are not renewed. The renegotiations right now are targeted the economic provisions. And there are complicated processes in place as well for termination of the overall compact. So I don't know how to directly address that question. I think what Professor O'Brien pointed out in her remarks that you delivered, Dr. Vid, are important in terms of whether we'll even get the US Congress to agree on the renewal of the economic provisions given the current state of Congress there. So there are a lot of sort of things that need to be done before we get to that point of whether we'll agree on those economic provisions, including the compact provisions. But at least the FSM has made it very clear that we want strong climate-related provisions in the economic provisions as we continue the compact. I'm just going to leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Clement. Any other words from? Okay. Last one. So no passing. Clement, this is addressed to you as well. Is there an international scheme requiring environmental impact statements for actions in international waters, such as deep seabed mining? If not, should there be?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So this has a connection with what I mentioned in my remarks, the negotiations for the so-called BBNJ instrument or the High Seas Treaty, whatever you want to call it. There are provisions, there's a whole part in the BBNJ instrument that talks about environmental impact assessments that need to be done for activities that impact areas beyond national jurisdiction, including the international seabed area. So there is international efforts toward that end. The BBNJ instrument has not entered into force, technically hasn't even been adopted. We just finalized the substantive negotiations, but that's where the international community is going. At the same time, different sectors, what are called sectors, such as fisheries and seabed mining, et cetera, that are already existing, do have standing sort of obligations under international law, including under the Law of the Sea Convention, to conduct environmental impact assessments, or at least the parties to those sectors have to conduct environmental impact assessments. And that's part of what we're negotiating right now here in Jamaica, in the International Seabed Authority, so that if deep seabed mining goes ahead in the international seabed area, it has to go ahead with, among other things, robust environmental impact assessments processes in place to manage it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Clement. I would also just like to recognize that Clement is a Richardson alumnus. So,
I actually missed that specific classroom.
yeah, I'm sure you spent a lot of time in here. An applause for our amazing panel. All for your remarks, and we will reconvene. We'll take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 11:35.